Chris Sewall here, baseball card collector, investor, dealer in that order. Welcome everyone. Question and answer time. Thank you everyone for submitting questions. Let's do it. First question was sent in by Mike, who wrote, "When will we be able to consider cards from the 90s and early 2000s as vintage or modern vintage? Will it be after we've reached 2030 or later?" That's a good question. I really don't know. I've always considered the vintage modern cutoff to be 1980. That was the old Beckett definition, and I thought that made a lot of sense. Although I think that's kind of outdated. I think cards from the 80s today are really more considered vintage at this point. I mean, they're 40 years old. So cards from the 90s and early 2000s, yeah, maybe another 10 years or so until people start to think of those as like vintage. But I kind of think we need like a mid category, kind of like what you're saying. You got your vintage, you got your, what do you call it, modern vintage, and then your modern. That makes sense to me because a 1995 card is nothing like a 1955 card. So yeah, maybe it's time to add a mid category. Next one sent by Mike, who wrote, "Wondering what kind of percentage you put on dealing in other sports. About 50% of my sales come from NASCAR, WWE, golf, etc. Anything specific you look for in dealing in that type of stuff, and if you collect anything from those?" So for me personally, it's very little. The vast majority of what I buy and sell is baseball, football, and basketball. A little bit of soccer, a little bit of hockey, a little bit of non-sports. But everything else maybe combined is like, I don't know, 1% or so. But that's just me. Every dealer is different. If you've figured out a way to do it with that big a portion of it being sort of the other sports, that's cool. Collecting wise, no, I don't collect much from these categories. A little bit of soccer and a little bit of like Star Wars, but very, very little. The majority of what I collect is, again, baseball, football, basketball. Next three questions come from Scott. First is, if someone wants to display their best parts of their collection out in the open somehow, but understands that it's better for the long-term preservation of their cards to keep them out of the light and humidity, how would you advise someone to address that? 2, any thoughts on the recent flow line cracks found in some of the newer PSA slabs? And 3, what's your go-to method for protecting slabs? Not into the heavy rubber band guards, but have used some basic plastic sleeves simply to prevent unnecessary scratching. The problem is, as it turns out, these plastic sleeves leave faint vertical scratches on the slabs. I've been investigating some basic scratch remover products. Have you come across this issue at all? So in terms of like displaying your cards, I wouldn't be too worried about it. You just don't want extremes. Like, if your cards are displayed in a room and when you're not in the room you keep the lights off, that's going to be fine. If once in a while you come in and turn the lights on, that's fine. I mean, you just don't want them always shown in the light or in the sun. You want that minimized. So if you're displaying them, I don't think the light's going to be an issue. Same thing with humidity. Just make sure the room is not extremely hot or extremely cold or extremely humid or something like that. Just if it's a standard room, you should be fine to display them. I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Big picture, just again avoid the extremes. Number 2, recent thoughts of the flow line cracks on some of the newer PSA cases. I actually have not experienced this at all. I saw a couple people did videos on it. I mean, if that's there, PSA needs to fix that up quick. That's obviously a big problem. But again, I haven't experienced it personally. So, what's your go-to method for protecting your slabs? I generally just use penny sleeves. Let's see if I have. I generally just use penny sleeves like this. They're actually postcard sleeves, 3x5s. And then for my best stuff, I buy these like slab guard plastic protectors, which I like a lot. They're not really common. Like, you can't find them at shows, but you can find them on eBay and on Amazon and stuff. But they're pretty expensive. They're like $3-4 a piece. So I only sort of put my top cards in those. Next question is from Garth, who wrote, "Baseball card collector, investor, dealer in that order is a phrase your viewers know well. However, I'd hazard a guess that by volume you do more with cards as a dealer, investor, and collector in that order. What percentage of cards that pass through your hands in a year would you estimate fit into each bucket, collector, investor, and dealer?" Yeah, so today, the vast majority of cards that come into my possession are as a dealer. The term collector, investor, dealer in that order is not in reference to what I am today. It's in reference to what I have been in my life. I started off as a pure collector for a long time. Eventually started investing, and then about 10-15 years ago, I became a full-time dealer. And so that's what in that order is in reference to. And it's also sort of in reference to my mentality. Like, I'm a full-time dealer. That's what I am today. But I've always had a collecting mentality because that's how I started out in the hobby for a long time. And I have some, investment mentality as well because I've been investing a long time as well. So that's what the phrase is in reference to. Next 2 questions were from Michael, who wrote, "Is it usually the case where when a pop count is low and you think you have a pretty mint card, that you should always get it graded? I mean, is there always a collector looking for a graded issue, right?" The second question, does PSA refuse to grade any card without a number? For example, I acquired a 2013 Diamond Prospects Kris Bryant pre-rookie card and also 2 Leaf Premier NHL Convention cards featuring Luc Robitaille and Mario Lemieux. and neither have even a pop count page. I've seen them graded, but not by the big four. So to answer your first question, should you always grade a low pop count mint card? Absolutely not. There's going to be lots of examples where you would not want to do that. I assume you're talking about from like a resale perspective. But yeah, there's going to be lots of examples where cards, even though they're rare and low pop, low serial number or something like that, just there's not any demand for them. So you're not going to be able to sell them for anything, even if they're graded. And yeah, it's not going to be worth the $20 or whatever it is to send it in for grading. That's something that sort of takes experience to sort of figure out what cards in this category make sense for and which does not. But there's lots of examples where you would not want to do that. Second question, does PSA refuse to grade any card without a number? No, they'll grade cards without a number. I don't know the specific cards you're referring to here, but there are cards like convention cards sometimes, or aftermarket cards, or unlicensed cards where different the different companies won't grade them for various reasons. So, but yeah, whether the card has a number or not is not relevant towards whether they'll grade it or not. Next question is from Wick. He wrote, when getting an in-person autograph from a company that has local athletes sign where you pay $100 to $200 or whatever the price is, and you can bring a card or a jersey in and meet the athlete, and they have Beckett representative there, when you can get the Beckett witnessed sticker on the back of your item, do you think it devalues a card if you're going to get it slabbed by PSA? I've done this a few times because I was worried that for some reason PSA wouldn't authenticate the auto but didn't want to take the chance. But then after getting it slabbed up, I always regret it and feel like the sticker is an eyesore on the back of the card and devalued it. Curious on your thoughts. So I've actually never done this personally, and I don't know. I haven't like researched whether that sort of impacts the value, but I would guess not. I think the sticker, I don't know, kind of adds it. I mean, it's sort of, to me, it's like double authenticated. So personally, I like the sticker. I would not think that it hurts its value, but yeah, if somebody knows otherwise, please leave it in the comments. Next question from Craig Clemens 6647 wrote, I have a 68 mantle that I got in a trade over 35 years ago, but it's in a screw down case. What's your advice? Leave it as is or remove it to get it graded? So in terms of whether you should get the card graded, that's not something I can say without seeing the card in person. So I wouldn't be able to advise anything there. I would definitely recommend taking it out of the screw down. Screw downs have been shown over time to they can damage cards in various ways. One is just to sort of press down the stock, which PSA will consider that altered at times. So I would definitely get it out of the screw down, get it into a penny sleeve and either a top load or a semi-rigid. And then it's sort of up to you to decide if you feel like it's a card worthy to send in for grading. Next one sent in by Superbad0415 wrote, do you think Holmgren and Wemby are great investments? So it sort of depends on what you mean by investment. Like if you mean buy a bunch of their cards, put them in the closet, forget about them for 10 or 20 years, and then 10 or 20 years down the road they're worth a whole lot more. Absolutely not. I don't think any young player is a good long-term investment in this manner. Young players and prospects, their cards are just so priced so high out of the gate. All this greatness is baked in. The vast majority of them are just not going to live up to the hype. They're going to go down in value over time. Even the ones that pan out are probably going to go down in value. It's really only that one really like needle in a haystack player who will actually go up in value. So no, I would never say those are any young active player is a good long-term investment. If you're talking about like short-term investment, like you want to buy during the off season and sell while they're hot during on one of their runs during next season, yeah, that can pan out if you understand the gamble aspect of it and sort of are really paying close attention to the timing of things. Yeah, it can be a good they can be good short-term plays if that's what you're going for. Dustin Andrews 7409 wrote, can you do a series on vintage cards, talk about some history of the cards and why they are rare, then do a short series on modern and talk about the cards you love and why? Yeah, so I've done a lot of videos on vintage cards and modern cards and ones I like and exactly into the categories you're saying. I think I have something like 800 videos on my channel now at some point, so a lot of them are fall into the category of what you're saying, and I will certainly be doing more of that stuff in the future as well. Jude999 wrote, if you're not selling a card, what do you think about leaving it ungraded? That way a slab you get does not become outdated. Then if you ever decide to sell the card, you can get it slabbed at that time with the latest and greatest. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I like it. I mean, I guess the only potential issue would be if you know you're going to eventually sell it, in a year from now you decide, okay, it's time to sell it. Well, you now have to wait a couple months to go through the submission process, and who knows, maybe PSA is more expensive then, or maybe they have longer wait times. I don't know, but I guess that's the one thing to consider. But otherwise, yeah, your logic makes sense to me. Michael G 9624 wrote, "What is your favorite set of all time and your least favorite?" So if you're just talking about like card design, not like the cards that are in the set, but the card design, 1956 Topps Baseball is my favorite card design vintage-wise ever. I just love the vertical layout. And 1996 Pinnacle Skylines baseball is a beautiful insert set, also vertical. And it's like the player in front of the skyline of the city they play for. It's a really nice looking card. And the sky is clear. It's really, yeah, nice. Those are probably my two favorite card designs of all time. Least favorite, I don't know, 1991 Fleer is pretty ugly, both in baseball and football. I don't know what Fleer was doing that year, but the basketball's not too bad. But baseball's just like ugly yellow, and then football's just like ugly green. And neither set has any notable anything, like no notable rookies. They're all mass produced, so the most valuable card in either set's like, 5-10 cents, something like that. So 1991 Fleer, I'm going to say 1991 Fleer football, my least favorite set of all time. Next one sent in by Chris Kuker7548. Hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Been an avid viewer of the channel for a while and noticed that nearly everything you've shown us from your PC or items that you've purchased are trading cards, sports or Star Wars. Do you not have any interest in adjacent items like ticket stubs, autographed baseballs, jerseys? And if not, why do you think that is? Is it that you can't sort and go through it like you can cards? I find myself growing more interested in sports items that aren't necessarily cards. Cards have sort of been the gateway into those other collections. Yeah, so I've just always been a pure card guy. I've always been that way. Still am today. I imagine I always will be. I don't really know why that is. I guess it's just who I am. But I buy collections all the time, and there'll be other stuff in there, autographs and memorabilia and comics and magazines and things like that. And just that stuff never really interested me. I don't really know why, but I'll just move that quickly so I can play with the cards. That's just the way I operate. I know a lot of people who have, similar to you, were into cards first and have sort of graduated into other things. And yeah, that's very cool. But I don't imagine, I don't see myself following that path. Sam Hill 93 wrote, I know you're a Baltimore guy, but a Commanders fan. Did the Colts leave before you were old enough to be a fan? Do you have you had any love for the Ravens since they arrived in 96? Are you raising your son to be a Baltimore sports fan or a DC sports fan or a combo? Or are you going to spare him the misery of sports fandom? So I grew up in Maryland, but I was just outside the DC border. I was actually much closer to DC than Baltimore. So I always considered myself a fan of the Washington teams first, but Washington did not have a baseball team in the late 80s and early 90s, so I was a fan of the Baltimore Orioles. And Baltimore didn't have a football team, so I was naturally a fan of the Washington football team. And that's how I've always been my number one teams. When the Ravens and the Nationals came to town in the late 90s and early 2000s, yeah, I became sort of secondary fans of them, but still my number one rooting interest is the Baltimore Orioles and the Washington Commanders. Sorry, I threw up in my mouth a little bit there, but my son has just finished second grade. He actually hasn't shown much interest in sports, but once in a while, like all the kids in his class get excited about a Baltimore game because we now live in Baltimore. So my sense is if he does eventually get into sports, he'll probably be more likely to be a fan of the Baltimore teams, which would be fine with me. This question was sent in by Patrick, who wrote, with all the recent talk about altering cards, I wanted to know what you and the community thought about this scenario. If you trim a hand-cut card to make it more or look even better, is that unethical? These cards were cut out to begin with, so wondering if this would be viewed as unethical. I attached a sample card from eBay. That is a really interesting question, great question, and just to sort of fill everyone in, there are a lot of hand-cut cards, especially in the 1920s like this one, where it was up to you or me, or the owner of the item, to cut the card out of a panel. It wasn't cut out at the factory. You were supposed to take scissors or a knife and cut it out as you saw fit. And this particular one obviously has been ripped out as the edges are very wavy, but it was up to the owner to cut the card. That's why it's called hand cut. So if you were to get this card today, let's say it was not in the holder, and you looked at the wavy edges and were like, you know what, I can cut these edges straight like it was supposed to be done, and you took scissors and cut it straight, would there be some sort of ethical issue there? My initial thought is I certainly would not do it just to avoid any sort of gray area. But would I have a problem with somebody else doing it? I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm asking the community here. What do you all think? Do you think there's something wrong with taking a hand cut card and hand cutting it further to potentially get a better grade? ACD 1994 asked, what are your tips and advice to get where it's possible to obtain and buy some of the higher end or more scarce cards that are worth thousands of dollars? Best way or ways to approach set building, especially since some sets have a lot of cards? Would you start with the rookies or the commons and lesser expensive ones? What about buying the set raw vintage versus the set already graded? So your questions are kind of too general for me to really be able to answer for you. How do you obtain cards worth thousands of dollars? I mean, is that an amount of money you're able to save up or not? Or what sort of cards do you have in your collection? Are you able to trade? I don't know. There's lots of different ways to do it. but it's very dependent on each individual. Each individual situation is going to be different. And same thing with your second question. Set building. How do you set build? There's no rules. It's perfectly however you want to do it. I know people who like to do the commons first because they can buy a large, bulk lot of commons and then fill in the stars. And I know other people who like to buy all the stars first and then go to shows and pick out all the commons secondary. And they both make perfect sense. Buying the set raw vintage versus graded. I mean, again, that's going to depend on your own personal preference. What do you like? What do you collect? Do you want the set raw? Do you want the set graded? What sort of budget do you have? What are your goals? There's no sort of rules to a lot of these questions. It's really based on the individual. Matthew Cook 2097 wrote, I've been wanting to buy a Griffey auto on eBay that I've been specifically watching for months because it's on a specific card, but I haven't pulled the trigger because it's graded by PSA, trading card, auto grade 10, without the title of the actual card on the PSA holder. In this case, does PSA refuse to grade the card when it is an in-person auto and not pack inserted? If the card was graded too, even a bad grade, I would buy it immediately because it's a card from my childhood. But what's with this? If I bought it, could I send it to PSA and get both, or do they refuse it? So unfortunately, there's no real way to know because if a card is labeled trading card on a PSA DNA label, it could mean one of two things. One is that the card is not authentic; it's a fake. So PSA is not willing to authenticate the card or label the card on the label, but the autograph's legit, so they are authenticating the autograph. The other possibility is that the submitter just chose not to have the card authenticated; they just wanted the autograph authenticated. So in either of those cases, it would just be labeled trading card. In case A, the card's a fake, and in case B, the card is real. So there's no way to know which one it is, unfortunately. I believe PSA is changing this, and I certainly hope so because, there needs to be a very clear distinction there, and at the moment there's not. KC8767 wrote, I'm interested in how the death of a Hall of Famer, recent death of Jerry West, for example, affects card prices. How long do price surges last before they start to level off? So there's not going to be like a hard rule to this that always applies. Every situation is different, but in general, usually there's a surge, right when the player passes away, and that sort of lasts a few days, maybe up to a week or so, and then 1 to 2 weeks later, after he's passed, the card prices are more or less back down to where they were before, maybe a little bit higher, but not much. Again, that's not always the case. They don't always follow that pattern, but in general, that's sort of been what I've witnessed. M Freedom 1 asked, how many player collectors do you think there are for modern Hall of Famers? Realistically, how many David Ortiz collectors or Joe Mauer collectors, for example, are there in the world to buy non-rookie cards of such retired players? It's a really great question. It's something I've thought about quite a bit because I make a lot of player lots for eBay. I'm not really sure, but I would sort of guess that it's more than you would think, or, more than you or I would think on the surface. Whenever I make player lots like those, David Ortiz or Joe Mauer for eBay, they always sell. And my lots are large, like 1,000 cards for $200 type thing. They always sell, and across all eras, getting back into the '80s, Robin Yount and Kirby Puckett and Ryan Sandberg and Ozzie Smith, and in the '90s, Larry Walker and Chipper Jones, and into the 2000s, David Ortiz and Joe Mauer, like your examples. They always sell, and that's how I collected when I was a pure collector. I collected Cal Ripken. I wanted all my Cal Ripken cards, and all my friends collected that way. They all had their favorite player, and they just collected as many of their favorite players they could. There was a Jose Canseco collector, and a Don Mattingly collector, and a Fred McGriff, and Ricky Henderson, and Dave Justice collector. And that was sort of what we did, and I think a lot of people still do that. And, maybe that's not something we see all that often because, that's not maybe something you would show off on Instagram or talk about on YouTube, but 1% of 1% of collectors are actually on social media. It feels like a lot of them are, but I think a lot of collectors behind the scenes collect this way. It's a very fun way to collect. You get a lot of cards. You can get a lot of cards cheap of your favorite player, and so I would imagine it's still a big, a bigger part of the hobby than it might seem. No Way Never Again asked, do you hate a card, and if so, why? Hate a card? I mean, the only thing that comes to mind at all is the 1991 Fleer again. Chris Sabo. So when I would play baseball with my cousins, in the early 90s, we would pretend to be the best player in the league who had our first name. So like my cousin Kirk was Kirk Gibson, my cousin Eric was Eric Davis, and Chris was Chris Sabo because he was the best Chris in baseball at the time. And this 1991 Fleer card, he's swinging and it looks like he missed the pitch by like a foot, not even close. So when this card came out, my cousins made fun of me a lot for this. So yeah, this would be the card that, the only card I can think of that I kind of hate. Next one was sent by Mandog Mac, who wrote, how do you feel about Topps putting the first Bowman logo on ultra-modern Legends cards such as Cy Young, Babe Ruth, etc.? yes, technically these are their first Bowman cards because Bowman wasn't around when they played, but I think it's silly and not the point of first Bowman. I really like the first Bowmans. They definitely have their spot in the hobby as the first official pre-rookie card. They're probably becoming more desirable than actual rookie cards, but I don't think this takes away from it. Have you ever seen any first Bowman Legends? And do you have any opinions on this trial by Topps Fanatics? So I don't know that I have a really strong opinion about it. I'm probably similar to you. You know, I think it's a little silly and gimmicky, but if it catches on and people like it, I certainly have no problem with that. I think Fanatics is going to try a bunch of new things here. Like they're going to bring a bunch of new ideas and fresh concepts and you know, sort of try to spice things up a little bit. And I think that's overall a very good thing. Like the hobby could use a new set of eyes and new ideas. So, you know, much more important than whether I like it is whether the hobby as a whole likes it. I mean, again, a lot of these are probably going to seem kind of gimmicky and silly. And I mean, you know, Cy Young first Bowman card, like, come on. But hopefully they catch on and people like it. And, you know, I don't think it in any way diminishes, you know, actual first Bowman cards. I don't think there's any correlation there. Jacob Gadrolt 6680, I hope I pronounced your name right, asked, what is your favorite hobby conspiracy? Yeah, so, you know, I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. I'm sort of the opposite, actually. I find the conspiracy theories quite annoying, but, you know, every once in a while you hear one that's sort of funny. I remember a couple of years ago, somebody was trying to explain to me that PSA was run by the mob, and it was all just a big money laundering scheme. And, you know, when I sort of asked them, well, how would that even work? You know, I don't think they knew what money laundering even meant, but, you know, I guess in theory it's possible. Next question was from Weedy7. He wrote, how about you talk about your income before, during, and after the pandemic? You don't have to be specific, but your thoughts on flow and profit. So I was sort of a unique situation in the sense that I was actually living in Europe during the pandemic, and I missed out on the card boom of 2020 and 2021 and a couple of years after. Before the pandemic, my card business was just slow and steady growing, very, very steadily growing well. And in 2019, basically took 4 years off and went to live in Europe. And came back in 2023, and yeah, just sort of picked right back up where it was before, and is now slow and steady growing again. I would say that from a dealer's perspective, the hobby's in a much better place now than it was in, say, 2019. Just clearly a lot more people involved. Things sell a lot quicker in general, a lot more places to sell, a lot more potential buyers all over the place. So, you know, I think from my dealing career, I think this is the best time that it's ever been. But that's it. Thank you, everyone, for all the great questions, and thank you, everyone, for all the continued support. I really, really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll see you again next time. Thanks, everyone.